I once took a taxi in Tokyo late at night. The driver was a man in his late 40s, immaculate white gloves, polite to a fault, handling the wheel with this weary sort of precision. We started talking about the economy, and I expected the usual small talk, gas prices, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Instead, he began analyzing the global semiconductor supply chain. And I mean, with the depth and vocabulary of a university professor, it was spinning.
Wow.
So it turns out he wasn't a career driver. He was an engineering graduate from the mid-90s, top of his class.
Oh, okay. So there's a story there.
A huge story. But when I asked how someone with his background ended up driving a cab, his whole demeanor shifted instantly. The politeness just cracked, and it was replaced by this flash of cold, cynical anger. He didn't blame his own skills. He blamed a specific number, 5%.
Type of percent unemployment.
Exactly. He told me that for decades, the world praised Japan for keeping its unemployment rate miraculously under 5%.
Yeah.
But then he points to these empty office buildings we're driving past, and he says, that number is a lie. It's a prison.
That's an incredibly powerful way to put it.
It was. He explained that to keep that statistic looking pretty, companies hoarded older, unproductive staff in window seats, refusing to fire them, while completely freezing out his entire generation of graduates.
So to him, the stability wasn't an achievement at all.
No. He said it was a distinctive form of cruelty that sacrificed the young to protect the old. And it was just this chilling realization for me. The very policy designed to save the country's economy was exactly what had destroyed his life.
That anecdote cuts right to the core paradox of Japan's structural choices after the bubble collapsed in the early 90s.
He really does.
We always hear this phrase, the lost decades, and that originally meant the 1990s, but now we're often talking about 20 or even 30 years.
Precisely. And that taxi driver's story, that's the micro-level consequence of these huge macro choices. We've seen that this period was just characterized by, annual GDP growth, struggling at 1% or even less.
Yeah, flat nominal GDP, stagnation, and yet somehow they fended off mass unemployment. That's the paradox.
So that's the mission of this deep dive then. We're going to unpack that trade-off. What happens when a society pivots really radically from being focused on relentless growth to one that's focused on, stockpiling?
Institutional and social stockpile, yeah. We need to understand the complex policy choices Japan made after 1990 and really follow that thread all the way through to the long-term economic and, maybe most importantly, the human consequences.
When stability becomes the highest and maybe the most expensive priority.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start with the macroeconomy. When the speculative bubble burst around 1990, the real estate, the banking, the initial shock wasn't a total overnight collapse, was it? It was more of a slow, creeping realization.
That's right. The feeling on the ground, and your taxi driver mentioned this, was a lingering optimism for a few years. There was this belief that, these aggressive, world-beating Japanese companies would just power through it.
A temporary adjustment.
It's a temporary adjustment. And investment did continue for a bit on the assumption that strong manufacturing exports would sort of absorb the domestic shock. But that optimism, it just evaporated around 1993.
So 1993 is the real turning point.
It's the true inflection point, absolutely. That was the year Japan's GDP first registered negative growth, which for them was just culturally and historically shocking.
Right.
But even more critically, the unemployment rate, which had been, comfortably below 2% for decades, it was a marker of Japanese success, of their uniqueness. It suddenly jumped. It started pushing toward 3%.
A move from, say, 1.8% to 3% doesn't sound catastrophic in, a U.S. or European context.
Not at all.
But in the environment of Shushin Koyu lifetime employment, that's a four-alarm fire, isn't it?
It was an existential crisis for the government, for corporate leadership. That sudden jump in 93 just shattered the illusion of stability, and it drove policymakers to a really critical set of decisions.
And the goal was just stop the bleeding.
The overwhelming goal was to prevent mass bankruptcies and the unemployment shock that would come with it. It was all about protecting Shushin Koyu.
Okay, so they chose survival over surgery. What were the main policy levers they pulled at that moment?
The policies were really focused on propping up the existing system, not reforming it. So the first main priority was aggressive corporate restructuring and mergers.
Right.
This was designed to prevent insolvency in the short term. They basically encouraged profitable firms, or firms that were heavily backed by the big banks, to acquire the severely indebted ones.
And this wasn't really for business synergy, was it? It was just to hide the problem.
Less for synergy, more for stabilization. You're just transferring liabilities and preserving jobs under the umbrella of a company that's still solvent.
Okay, so that's priority one. And the second one, and this is where we get into the zombie economy, right? Which sounds like a movie title, but it's a very real economic term.
It is the absolute foundation of the zombie economy. The banking sector itself was massively impaired by falling property values. They were the original zombie banks.
So the banks themselves were the problem first.
They were. They had massive non-performing loans, NPLs. But instead of recognizing those losses, which would have forced huge layoffs and politically painful bailouts, they started engaging in what analysts now call sham loan restructurings.
Okay, so break that down for me. What does a sham loan restructuring actually look like on the ground? How do you pretend a bad loan is a good one?
It's basically a mechanism for avoiding reality. So instead of foreclosing on a borrower who can't pay, the bank would just extend the term of the loan. Or they'd lower the interest rate to something artificially low, sometimes even zero.
Wow, zero interest.
Or, and this is key, they'd capitalize the interest payments. They'd just add the unpaid interest back onto the principal of the loan.
So the debt just keeps getting bigger. But on paper, the company looks like it's making its payments.
Exactly. It allowed the company, the borrower, to meet its debt servicing requirements on paper, even if its actual operating profits weren't nearly enough. They were providing just enough life support, just enough new credit to keep the doors open.
But not enough for them to actually grow or invest.
Not at all. And that company, the one unable to cover its debt costs from its actual profits, became the zombie firm.
So it's this vicious cycle. The bank keeps lending to the company to stop it from failing, because if the company fails, the bank has to admit the loan is worthless, which the bank can't afford to do.
It's a cycle of interdependence built on, frankly, denial. And we have to be clear about how pervasive this was. At its peak, these zombie firms may have accounted for nearly 20% of all Japanese corporations.
20%. 1 in 5 businesses was essentially economic deadweight.
1 in 5. Protected by a continuous infusion of bank denial. It's a staggering figure.
Absolutely staggering. And this choice to preserve jobs at all costs, especially for the guys who are already there, it came at a huge immediate expense, didn't it? To the whole economy's dynamism.
The drag was immense, and it was systematic. First, you have just the raw resource consumption. These zombie firms were continually consuming valuable finite resources. They were sucking up bank loans, capital, social funds, skilled labor.
All without creating any real value.
Right. And the financial drain was just sobering. I mean, banks eventually had to write off hundreds of billions of dollars in debt related to these bailouts. That led to systemic banking crises throughout the 90s, especially the big one in 1998 that took down several major banks.
So it's like a perpetual financial hemorrhage.
Huh?
But the impact wasn't just on the zombies themselves. It actively punished the healthy companies, too.
Absolutely. This is what economists call the congestion effect, or crowding out. The sheer number of zombies in the market meant reduced profits for the genuinely healthy, innovative firms.
How so? Because they're competing for the same customers.
They're competing for market share, yeah. But the zombies are often supported by subsidized capital, these zero-interest loans, that let them lower their prices unfairly. They also absorb scarce labor and capital. So a profitable, forward-looking company might see its sales stagnate or its profit margins shrink because a zombie firm, propped up by a bank, can afford to undercut them.
So the market ends up rewarding the least efficient players.
That's precisely it. And the result was that it killed the incentive for the healthy firms to invest. The data is painful on this. The zombies actively crowded out investment and job growth at the non-zombie firms.
So the healthy companies saw their own capital spending go down.
Right. They delayed or canceled crucial upgrades, new technology, because the competitive market was just flooded with subsidized dead weight. At the very moment when you need innovation the most, the market is actively punishing the innovators.
This brings up a huge point about opportunity cost. While Japan was tied up in this massive, messy domestic cleanup, managing all this debt and keeping zombies on life support, what was the rest of the world doing in the 1990s?
And that is the ultimate long-term strategic loss. While Japan was fighting these internal fires, completely focused on cost reduction and debt repayment, the US, Europe, and other emerging Asian competitors were moving at lightning speed.
In what areas?
In the defining technologies of the era. The internet, mobile computing, communications infrastructure. Japanese companies weren't investing in the next global wave because all their capital, all their best minds, were tied up managing the debris from the last wave.
Do we have a concrete example of that failure to invest?
The evidence is crystal clear in the capital expenditure data. Equipment investment in Japan just fell off a cliff in the early 90s. We're talking about a 30% reduction in just 2 years after 1991. When you stop investing in new tools, new factories, new R&D, you simply stop innovating.
And the most famous example of this is in semiconductors, right?
It's the most visceral example. Japan had been a global leader, totally dominant in memory chip production. But during this period of stasis, while they were managing the bubble's fallout, competitors, most notably South Korea's big conglomerates like Samsung, they made these aggressive, massive investments in next-generation fabrication plants.
And Japan just missed the boat.
They completely missed the shift, and it led to a permanent loss of market share and technological leadership. They never recovered that position.
So the stability policy, it worked in one sense. It protected the incumbent workers, the famous Midori Ozoku, the window sitters.
The guys who kept their jobs despite being unproductive, just sitting by the window all day.
Right. But that protection, that stability, it permanently damaged the entire nation's capacity for innovation for decades to come.
It was a brutal trade-off. They chose the past over the future. The policymakers, they achieved their immediate goal. They kept that headline unemployment figure low. But the cost was national competitiveness, structural economic health, and any potential for future growth. The stability they created was, fundamentally, a stability built on decay.
Which leads us directly to the human cost, the story of my taxi driver. If companies were hoarding these older, often unproductive workers to keep up the pretense of lifetime employment, to keep that 5% number low, how did they balance the books? The cost had to go somewhere.
It did, and the shock absorption, the cost, was overwhelmingly transferred onto the new graduates entering the workforce. That's the crucial analytical bridge here.
So the whole social contract broke down.
It fundamentally broke down for the incoming generation. The corporate sector, facing these massive debts, needed to cut costs fast. But politically, socially, they couldn't just fire the older, established workforce.
It's the path of least resistance, the lowest political cost, was to just stop hiring the young.
Precisely. The shock was absorbed entirely by the youth market. You have to understand the traditional system of Shinkiekatsu Sayo.
The huge, simultaneous mass recruitment of new graduates every April.
Right, it was a rite of passage. That system just fractured under the financial pressure. Companies weren't just tightening their belts, they slammed the door shut on new entry.
What was the scale of that? How bad was the cutback?
The cutback was catastrophic. For graduates entering the workforce in the mid-90s, the recruitment volume was slashed. Some estimates suggest a 50% reduction in openings in just 2 years.
50%.
Imagine graduating from university, expecting that traditional path that your parents had, only to find the entry doors half closed, no matter how good your grades are.
In this period, this is what's known as the employment ice age.
That's the one. It generally spanned the cohorts graduating between, say, 1993 and 2004.
So what did the government do to manage this? You had this sudden flood of highly educated but unemployed or underemployed young people.
They used stopgap measures. They were really delaying tactics, not structural solutions. One was this rural diversion plan, which encouraged urban grads to take short-term, government-subsidized infrastructure jobs in smaller towns.
Kicking the can down the road.
A very small road. A much larger tactic was the massive expansion of graduate school enrollment. Universities became essentially an expensive waiting room.
To ride out the recession.
Yeah. At one point, the data shows that over 60% of national university graduates were continuing straight into master's programs just to defer the job search until the economy theoretically recovered.
But those measures only delayed the problem.
Yeah.
You're just moving the job hunt from age 22 to age 24 or 25, and the job market was still frozen solid.
Exactly. This cohort is also called the Dankai Junior generation. They were born during the second baby boom in the 70s. So they were the most populous generation to hit a system that had just stopped hiring. It was just brutal macroeconomic timing.
And this leads to the most defining structural shift of the whole era, the institutionalization of instability. You're talking about the 1996 revision of the worker dispatch law, right?
That 1996 revision and the expansions that followed, that was the regulatory framework that formalized this whole flexible employment revolution. Before that, Dispatch workers, temp workers were restricted to only the most specialized fields.
And the new law opened it up to everything.
It opened up the use of temporary and contracted labor to a huge range of corporate functions.
So instead of hiring a full-time regular station employee with all the costs and responsibilities that come with that,
You could now legally and easily hire a Haken, a dispatch or temp worker, or a Kyaku, a short-term contract worker.
and that's the key structural change. The traditional station model, the one that provided security, benefits, subsidized housing, automatic raises, it just started getting replaced en masse by these non-regular roles.
The companies solved their cost problem immediately, and the scale of this transition is just stunning.
What do the numbers say?
The numbers are stark. They show a permanent structural change. The proportion of non-regular workers in the Japanese economy surged from under 20% in the early 90s to over 32% by 2003. And today, it's over 38%.
So this isn't just a cyclical adjustment. This is the creation of a permanent two-tiered labor market.
A permanent dual labor market, exactly.
Let's talk about the trap these non-regular jobs represented. Because they weren't just a temporary stopover on the way to a real career, were they? For the Ice Age generation, they were often a dead end.
There were systemic traps that generated long-term social inequality. These non-regular roles offered extremely low wages, often half that of their regular employee counterparts doing the exact same work.
Half the pay for the same job.
They provided minimal job security, no access to the traditional bonuses, which are a huge part of annual pay in Japan, maybe 30% or more, and crucially, little to no vocational training.
So you're underpaid, you're not learning new skills, and you're constantly worried about your contract not being renewed.
Right. Companies had eliminated their training budgets. They were only hiring for immediate capability. But the most damaging part, the real core of the trap, was the severe lack of upward mobility.
You couldn't make the jump.
It was incredibly difficult. Once you started down that non-regular path, the chances of converting to a regular seishin status were incredibly low. The data suggests less than half of non-regular workers managed to make that transition even over a 10-year period.
So you were essentially put on a lower track for life.
Locked out of the secure high-wage system. And if you happen to hit the job market between 1993 and 2004, you were likely funneled into this low-wage, high-precarity track with very little chance of escape, regardless of your credentials, like you're a taxi driver.
And these people are now in their 40s and 50s. They're supposed to be in their peak earning years.
Their peak earning years, yeah. The time they should be paying for a home, funding their kids' education. They just missed that critical one-time window for stable employment and career progression that was afforded to generations before them. It is the very definition of persistent intergenerational inequality.
So what does the long-term data say about the damage to this specific generation decades later?
The analysis is truly damning. A significantly lower percentage of the Ice Age generation ever achieved what you'd call settled regular employment right after graduation compared to their predecessors. They faced ongoing career instability well into middle age, constant worry.
And the economic hit.
Economically, they are severely disadvantaged. Their average lifetime income is the lowest among all cohorts. It's roughly 25% lower than those who graduated just before the bubble burst.
25%. Over a 40-year career, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars.
It's hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost income, lost savings, lost pension contributions. It's a massive wealth transfer away from them.
And this spills over into social consequences, right? It's not just about money.
Not at all. Economic precarity directly affects your life choices. This generation shows lower marriage rates, delayed family formation, significantly low savings, insecure housing. When you can't guarantee a stable income, the decision to take on the financial burden of a family or a mortgage becomes almost impossible.
We hear terms like freeders and neets associated with this group. What do those mean?
Freeders are basically people, usually defined as being under 35, who are hopping between part-time or temporary jobs. For the Ice Age generation, that definition has been stretched as they've aged. They're stuck in these roles into their 40s. They often lack proper pension coverage or health insurance.
And neets?
Neets are not in education, employment, or training. That's a smaller but significant group that's been entirely excluded from the labor market. They've often withdrawn completely out of frustration or disillusionment. And the real worry is that as this whole cohort approaches old age, they're financially fragile.
Which puts huge strain on the pension system.
Immense strain. Because they're entering retirement with inadequate private savings and state coverage.
The fact that the Japanese government itself now basically admits this was a catastrophe is Maybe the most sobering detail of all.
It is. They have special policy pages, entire support programs dedicated to the employment ice age generation. That official recognition confirms that this wasn't temporary or cyclical. It was a permanent systemic injury to the country.
The institutions saved themselves.
They did, by sacrificing a generation's potential. It's the legacy of that rigidity. The cost of preserving the old guard was borne entirely by the young.
Okay, let's circle back to that high-achieving engineering graduate driving my taxi. In a society that was historically built on meritocracy, where graduating from a good university was supposed to be your golden ticket, why didn't his education save him?
It's such a critical question. It collapsed because the traditional job system wasn't really designed to hire workers. It was designed to recruit potential.
What do you mean by that?
Historically, the big Japanese firms recruited based on the prestige of the university's name. They just assumed they would spend the first 5, maybe 10 years training that graduate from scratch in the company way.
So the degree was just an entry ticket for training.
Exactly. And that entire system hinged on the company's willingness and ability to invest in that long-term training. When the recession hit and cost-cutting became the #1 priority, that willingness to invest just evaporated instantly.
So the whole mechanism that linked academic merit to a secure job, campus recruitment system, it just stopped working.
Yeah.
What replaced it?
It was replaced by what we can only call the employment arms race, and it happened fast. With dramatically fewer of those stable, sachane openings available, students were forced to compete fiercely on every non-academic metric they could find.
So not grades.
Not grades. We're talking extensive unpaid internships, getting dozens of professional certifications, aggressively participating in seminars, and starting this stuff right from freshman year.
So they're spending all their time on these recruitment checkboxes instead of actual deep academic study. The meaning of the degree itself declined.
Absolutely. The priorities just completely shifted. And the companies, they adapted by demanding what they called instant combat capability, or sokusunryoku.
Right. They weren't interested in a blank slate anymore.
No. They needed someone who could hit the ground running on day one and start generating profit immediately. They had no budget or patience for training.
And the budget cuts confirmed that.
They did. Over 40% of firms just canceled their new employee training programs entirely. And because they weren't willing to train, they became incredibly intolerant of new worker errors.
Which led to higher turnover.
Dramatically higher. We saw early turnover jump to up to 30% of new hires leaving or being pushed out within 3 years. It used to be under 7%. The job market was demanding finished specialists, which the university system was completely unprepared to provide.
And then the final insult for someone like the taxi driver was the financial devaluation of the degree itself.
It was devastating. The market, which was now being driven by these big staffing agencies and public labor grading systems, it just stopped valuing the prestige of the degree.
So a graduate from a top university could get paid the same as
a high school graduate working for a temp agency, as companies relied more on these short-term contracts, they just standardized the pay scales. So that top degree became a necessary hurdle to clear, but ultimately it was a worthless one for entry into a fundamentally broken system.
This links directly to another big government plan from that era, the push to become a science and technology nation.
Yes, that was a huge initiative. Faced with all this global competition in the 90s, the government launched the Graduate School Emphasis Plan. They poured massive amounts of money into expanding graduate enrollment, especially in STEM fields.
The idea being to mass produce the researchers and innovators of the future.
Right. But just as they were ramping up the supply of these highly qualified people, the demand side of the equation just collapsed.
Because the big Japanese tech industries were losing their global standing.
Precisely. The semiconductor and consumer electronics industries, they no longer needed the huge R&D teams of the 1980s. So the expansion of the graduate schools completely outpaced the real demand for permanent, stable research positions, both in corporations and in academia.
The result being a huge surplus of talent with nowhere to go. You refer to them as high-credential refugees.
That term is tragically accurate. You had all these brilliant STEM graduates who couldn't find permanent corporate R&D jobs or tenure-track academic positions. They got stuck in this cycle of low-paid, non-regular, temporary academic posts, working on short-term grants or contracts.
And the pay was shocking.
Shockingly low. Many were earning under 2 million yen annually.
And for context, in a city like Tokyo, 2 million yen that's a service sector wage. It is nowhere near what a PhD should command.
Absolutely not. At that income level, forming a family, securing stable housing, saving for the future, it's nearly impossible in Japan's major cities. It created this extreme precarity for what should have been society's most educated, most valuable cohort.
And this led to the doctorate flight phenomenon.
It did. Young people, being rational actors, they started avoiding expensive and risky advanced degrees because the market was signaling zero return on that massive investment of time and money. Why spend 10 years getting a PhD if you're going to earn the same as an entry-level part-time office worker?
So if education, the traditional ladder for social mobility, stopped working,
Yeah.
what stepped in to determine success?
We saw a severe reversal. A move back towards social stratification. As meritocratic hiring faded, inherited capital and social networks became overwhelmingly important.
If you're not hiring on merit, you're hiring on connections.
You're hiring based on trust and connection. And this is where you see the rise of the upper-class citizen phenomenon, where family connections, wealth, existing social capital, that's what secured the few elite seichein positions that were left, not academic merit.
Which is a fundamental reversal of the entire post-war promise.
It's a severe reversal of social mobility. The promise that hard work and academic achievement could lift any family, that promise was broken. Opportunity became increasingly inherited, not earned.
Let's look at the universities themselves in all this. They were central to the old system, but you point out that they've really struggled to adapt to global standards. You call it the post-catch-up syndrome.
This is one of the most fascinating parts of the whole story. Japan's earlier success actually created its current vulnerability. Historically, Japan modernized by successfully and meticulously translating Western knowledge.
The vernacularization of science and tech.
Exactly. They translated everything into Japanese, which made advanced education accessible to a huge proportion of the population. It created a highly egalitarian and very strong domestic education system.
It's like they built a perfect high-speed regional railway, but they forgot to connect it to the global track system.
That's a perfect metaphor. That successful translation culture led to the depreciation of any need for widespread foreign language skills, especially English. Why learn English if everything you need to study, research, and work is available in high-quality Japanese?
And then when the world shifted, that weakness in English became a massive barrier to globalization.
A huge barrier. When global metrics like the Times Higher Education Rankings appeared, Japanese universities performed poorly, except for a handful of the old imperial national universities. They lacked international faculty, they published less in high-impact English journals, and they struggled to attract foreign students.
The very thing that promoted domestic equality education in Japanese became the barrier to global competitiveness.
Right. And the government has tried to fix this with things like the Super Global University Support Program. But that effort creates its own conflict.
So?
Because the global rankings incentivize elite behavior, publishing in English, recruiting international faculty, centralizing resources. A shift to English-based instruction, which you need to compete globally, risks creating a new, highly unequal hierarchy inside Japan based on linguistic advantage and family resources.
You risk creating an elite track only accessible to the privileged.
Exactly. And it often prioritizes the STEM fields, which are easier to measure globally, while giving a cold shoulder to the humanities and social sciences. And the data shows this inward focus is still there despite the government's efforts.
Really?
The number of Japanese students studying abroad actually peaked in the early 2000s and has since declined significantly. At the end of the day, if the domestic job market doesn't fundamentally reward globalized skills, there's very little incentive for most students to acquire them. The system remains inwardly focused, protecting its historical structure, even at the expense of its future relevance.
So this whole deep dive, it's laid bare this profound national story. The decades of stagnation weren't an economic accident. They were the result of a calculated series of institutional choices. And these choices, they consistently prioritized employment stability and social harmony over creative destruction. They protected the incumbents over the newcomers. And they just staunchly resisted necessary, painful structural reforms.
And that conservative path, that choice, created deep, long-lasting structural damage that is still very much present today. We've talked through the impact, the zombie firms draining the economy's vitality.
The permanent class of non-regular workers who absorbed all the shocks.
And the catastrophic devaluation of higher education as a reliable path to a better life. It's all connected.
It really is the direct legacy of institutional rigidity. The policymakers, the industry leaders, they knew what the long-term reforms were. They knew they needed to let companies fail, force banks to write off debt, encourage worker retraining. But they consistently chose the path that would cause the least amount of short-term political and social pain.
The profound consequence of this systemic failure is that the very stability Japan sought to preserve ultimately entrenched a distinctive form of cruelty that continues to define the lives of the employment Ice Age generation today. It proves that sometimes the longest and wrongest road is the one paved with the intention of preserving the status quo.